We'll get into some interesting and challenging topics. So this first topic is on sexuality and identity, with a particular focus on queer and trans ideology, and especially trans, I think, have been very much in focus the last years. I believe all over the world, but certainly in the West and not least in the US. Then we will also have 2 sessions on homosexuality, different aspects of that. So I think we'll have quite a full day, a lot of topics to cover. But I want to start off by saying a few words about identity, because I think that's key to what we are discussing also today. And of course, in one sense, this must be a fundamental issue, the issue of identity. But it seems still that looking at human history, the identity issues have been more central the last 100 years than before, and definitely more central as a part of cultural and philosophical discussions. And I think one fundamental aspect of identity is that we form our identity in relation to others and to our sort of environment. Psychologists would talk about your parents, their role in forming the child's identity, and also other significant others that you sort of mirror yourself in, and you become who you are in relationship with others. But this also is true of society at large, so the society around you, the culture around you will shape your perception of who you are. This also means that the weaker our connection to something else and bigger than ourselves, the harder it will be to answer the simple question, who am I? If our relationship with other people and society is vague or sort of not so certain, you will also have a harder time realizing and deciding who you are for yourself. So questions like, where do I come from, is obviously key to identity. And also the question, where am I going? And of course, to most people in a secular society, you don't have really good answers to those fundamental questions. You don't know where you're coming from. You may have some kind of blind evolution as the only sort of explanation for who you are, and that's not a very strong identity marker, that you somehow come from the monkeys. And you have no clue where you're going, because you don't believe in God and you don't believe in heaven. So basically, you come from nowhere and you go to nowhere. And obviously that would make it harder for you to see, where am I in this bigger picture, because there is no bigger picture. So these fundamental questions have a lot to do with identity. And there's a Swedish theologian, Lasse Johansson, who puts it this way, that it is only when we are not sure where we belong or how we should choose that the idea of identity emerges. It is born as a problem and a task to be addressed. So I think there is a reason for why we, the last, say, 100 years, and especially the last decade, have been almost obsessed with identity issues, especially in the Western part of the world. Because I think this is also a consequence of the big changes that have taken place in our societies. And that goes for most of the world, I think, over the last 100 years. If you, for instance, compared the industrialized world with the old farmer society, we can say that the farmer society was and is characterized by quite clear expectations and traditions. That kind of society has a sort of quite a clear set of expectations, traditions, quite self-evident roles for children and adults, and also for women and men. And as I said before, with the feminist movement, it grew from the transition from farmer society into industrializations, where maybe the roles remained, but the whole context had changed fundamentally. But in that old society, it was quite easy to see your place in the whole. So this plays into the identity issue. You saw, what kind of cog am I in the big machinery? And since you had the answer to that, it was also easier to find your place in life. But then came industrialization, urbanization, many of the previous traditions and expectations ended. And with that also the identity issues have become much more important. So looking at our own time, we see this escalating, where traditions are fluid, family constellations are fluid, gender roles are fluid, values are fluid. For the young people especially, it's not even clear where to draw the line between the physical life and the virtual life. I mean, no wonder people are confused, because everything that used to shape your identity, put your sort of place in the whole, has been taken away piece by piece. That to me is a major explanation to why identity is such a hot issue these days. This is particularly clear and important when we talk about sexuality issues, because one of the big changes basically is that sexuality has become an identity issue. That was not always the case. Going 100 years back, most people would not reflect on their sexuality or connect it with their identity at all. Whereas today, especially in the LGBTQ movement, sexuality is viewed as maybe the major identity marker of a person. So you have lots of roles and expectations, but what really defines you is your sexuality in some circles. And this is really something new. And I think we need to remember this also when we have the discussions that we will look into later on with homosexuality. The Bible certainly talks about same-sex relationships and has quite a clear stand in that regard, but it does not discuss sexual identity, because that's quite a foreign concept to the biblical writers. They talk about the actions, how we use our sexuality, and they have quite strong standpoints on that. But we cannot read into those texts the issues of identity, because that is not applicable. We should have our identity in Christ. That's what the Bible teaches us, and actually nothing else. We can of course identify in some way both with our gender and our culture and our nationality, and that is nothing wrong, but our primary identity in the Bible is that we are children of God. And that is also of course why the church can have all these different identities within it, united by Christ. So that's a very powerful teaching, I think. Looking at history, and you have found out by now that I'm interested in history and also the history of science and ideas, how things have sort of developed, and why different thoughts have been influential in different parts of history. I think that really helps us to understand why we are where we are right now. And I actually have a quote here, as you have seen in the papers, by Michel Foucault. He was a famous French philosopher in the 20th century, one of those who has shaped what we call postmodernism. And he was a homosexual, which is not irrelevant at all. He wrote quite a lot about sexuality, and he also explored the topic of sexual minorities. And sometimes the church is sort of accused for focusing very much on these issues, but what Michel Foucault and others have shown is that looking at history, the ones who really put these topics on the agenda were the scientists of the late 19th century and early 20th century, where science focused very much on sexual deviations, and that had nothing to do with the church. This was a secular project. And well, since I have this quote, I might read it. In a famous book called The History of Sexuality from 1976, Foucault writes that the married couple with their ordered sexuality is entitled to more discretion. This is in the 19th century. It tends to function as a norm, a perhaps stricter but quieter norm. But what is instead being scrutinized is the sexuality of children, fools, and criminals. It is the desires of those who do not love the other sex. It is the dreams, the obsessions, the little manias, or the great sufferings. Now it's the time for these previously overlooked figures to come forward and to reluctantly confess their uniqueness. They are certainly not any less condemned, but they are listened to. I put this quote in here because in the overall discussion around sexuality, it tends to be said that it's the church that focuses a lot on sexuality issues. And looking at this historically, it simply is not true. It was secular society and actually the scientific community that had this focus to start with. And also one important thing is that how come sexuality became an identity issue? Well, once again, we should look at this move in the early or late 19th century and early 20th century, that it was the scientific community that started to sort of pinpoint different sexual deviations and sort of looking into that and discussing that. So that may be good to just know if you happen to discuss these things with colleagues or others who may have different opinions. But from there we can take a step once again into the gender movements of the last century, and we have already seen these different waves of feminism, with the first women's movement that emerged around the turn of the last century, which fought for equal rights for men and women, based on the fact that both biology and gender were different. That was self-evident in the first women's movement. Then in the 60s and 70s, we saw the appearance of second wave feminism, just to briefly repeat last session, talking about gender roles as social constructs. So that was new to the second wave feminism. And today's queer movement and a lot of today's feminism that we will talk about here now speaks about both our biological sex and our gender roles as constructs. And that, of course, is a very radical move, even hard to grasp if you think about it. But there are ways to describe reality in such a way. And through this, by denying even the biological reality, it also becomes much easier to deny norms that we used to take for granted. For instance, the norm of heterosexuality being some kind of default mode for humanity. That is denied by third wave feminists. Say there is no default mode. We are all just individuals on this floating scale. Or even the two gender norms, that we are male and female. So we will return to that question, but today in the wider LGBTQ movement, there are many kinds of sexual identities, male and female just being two. And actually when this was on the height in Sweden in 2015, where the queer theory was really the strongest push from so many places, and I will talk a bit more about that soon, we had 70 different genders to choose from in Swedish Facebook. 70. So man and woman would be two options, and then you could choose other, and on other there were 68 possibilities to write. Yeah, so gender is a very fluid concept in that way of thinking, obviously. So queer and trans would be two of those, but you have 66 more. So you can just imagine. And talking about a fluid landscape, imagine also being a young person trying to find your identity in such a landscape. Not very easy. And not hard to imagine people becoming quite confused in that kind of culture. So the LGBTQ movement has certainly been a very strong driving force in this development. And that's why I want to start with the Q in LGBTQ this session, and then go to trans after that. And the starting point of queer theory is the minority's experience of being different. I touched on that before lunch. Many people, not least in the LGBTQ movement, have experienced their minority position and experience as very difficult. So the idea of the queer movement is really to include those sexual minorities, not just homosexual people, but obviously with 60 gender identities floating around, there are many different varieties here. So the idea in queer theory is that everything is fluid, basically. And since everything is fluid, both your identity and your sexuality, you can't say that anything is more normal or less normal than the other thing. And to many sexual minorities, that has been a very sort of liberating message, because if there is no default mode, no one can point at you and say that you are a deviation from the norm. So there is some logic to it, but of course it is very far from the biological reality that certainly has a default mode. And actually, we also should look at our most basic dimension of gender, which is our chromosomes. Already, as I said, in the week 6 or 7 in the womb, it's designed which chromosomes should be, or how our chromosomes sort of will be coding for different hormones, and that defines us as male or female. In Sweden, I will use some Swedish examples, but they are translated into English, and I think they could be used anywhere, but these are some important voices in Sweden that have been working with this. So one social anthropologist that's in the forefront of queer theory in Sweden is called Fanny Ambjörnsson. And you don't need to remember her name, but this is her quote. "Queer, both as a political movement and as a theory, draws attention to a range of conditions in society that have to do with gender, sexuality, and power. But instead of seeking redress and tolerance for those who are most often discriminated against because of their sexual preference or identity, queer turns the spotlight on the allegedly normal. Instead of fighting to equate homosexuality with heterosexuality, queer asks us to think beyond the divergence, to simply turn upside down the assumption that there is a normal and an abnormal way to be a sexual woman or man. In this way, queer gives us the tools to question society's taken for granted truths, whether about gender, sexuality, or other forms of normality." What is this quote about? Well, you can say that queer thinking is a form of grid that you can put on your relationships, but also on society as a whole. It's based on a questioning of all talk of normality. And once, as Ambjörnsson says, turn upside down the assumption that there is a normal and an abnormal way to be a sexual woman or man. Basically saying that gender is a construct and gender is even irrelevant to who you are. And this also means that the queer ideologies, they don't want tolerance. Tolerance has been a very important word in the gender movement. But tolerance is basically a majority tolerating the minority. And to the queer theorists, that is not good enough. Because then you still sort of have a majority position, which is a power structure that they want to sort of get rid of. So they rather say that we are all just individuals on this fluid scale. There is no natural starting point with heterosexuality or masculinity or femininity being a starting point where you can sort of move away from that. No, we're all individuals, and there is no neutral ground. No majority that can sort of oppress the minorities. So this has quite a profound consequence for how you work with, for instance, something like equality. So before you would say that equality was to tolerate and sort of allow people to be who they are, but still sort of acknowledging that there are a majority position that most people would adhere to. In Swedish school system, and this started very strongly about 10 years ago, both in preschools and schools, we had a new pedagogy called norm criticism. So the work for equality was transferred into a queer theory idea that we should criticize the norms that are oppressive. And these norms, of course, were the traditional creation-based norms of heterosexuality as the default sexuality, masculinity and femininity as the default condition for humans. And just to say this, the ideology of queer in this sense was imported from San Francisco. So that's where it all comes from, the west coast of the US. a former employee of the National Agency for Education in Sweden, she describes this project like this. I think it's quite a good quote to explain this ideology. She says that activities aimed at curbing discrimination and offenses by increasing the tolerance of children and students risk instead to consolidate power positions of certain categories at the expense of others. The reason for this is that the pedagogy of tolerance risks pointing out the other, for example the homosexual, as the deviant, thus maintaining heterosexuality as dominant and privileging. In this way, heterosexuality is taken for granted and rendered invisible in schools. The heterosexuality norm is repeated and made natural within the school walls. And this is, to queer theorists, the worst thing that you could imagine, that people think it's natural to be heterosexual, because then you still, as a sexual minority, have to sort of fight for your existence. We want to sort of crush the whole norm so that no one can take precedence over the other, if you get the thinking. And this is much more radical than traditional feminism. This is really pushing things one step further. And even tolerance become a bad word in this ideology. Because tolerance still, as she writes, maintains heterosexuality, for instance, as something natural. I think norm-critical pedagogy, as we have had in Sweden for about 10 years, and as I said, going back to some theorists in San Francisco area, is a good way of understanding this kind of thinking. So everything that is perceived as excluding the sexual minorities is viewed as oppressive. We in this ideology, you also avoid talking about deviations at all, and a different example could be disability, the concept of disability. By the same theorists, that would be sort of pointing out someone as a deviant, to be disabled. So if you don't hear with your ears, you would say that you are disabled in that matter. So the queer theorists would say that that is not a good way of talking about people. We just talk about functional variation. So we're on a scale where we have varied functions. Some hear with their ears, some don't hear with their ears. Some see with their eyes, some don't see with their eyes. It's just a variation. But we don't talk about disability or handicap, because that is perceived as rude or accusing. So that's the same kind of thinking, but on another sort of aspect of life. If you go to Swedish Wikipedia, they write this about norm criticism. It's a concept used by people who believe that there are a number of norms in society that give individuals who follow these norms more power in society than others, and how these norms, when desirable, can or should be changed. A norm-critical perspective means that the focus is on changing the norms rather than making people fit into the existing norms. And I think you should note the Marxist lingo here, because it talks about power, of structures, of privileges. And so it's the same thinking really that you have in old school Marxism. So norms are perceived as expressions of power, and the same of course goes with truth claims. To claim that you have truth would be called power language and inappropriate in that way. And even talking about things as normal or abnormal is something that should be opposed and as viewed as inappropriate. And as we saw already, one is particularly aggressive towards norms in the area of sexuality, because this kind of theory comes from the LGBTQ movement from start. So the norms of heterosexuality and two genders are very much criticized. And I will give a couple of examples of this, but just to make a reflection here from a Christian point of view, this is a head-on attack, of course, on what I, as a Christian, would call the creation order. Because the creation order really is about these norms. We are created as male and female. It is very natural to have a default mode of heterosexuality, because without it we would soon be non-existent as a race, obviously. So it's not a random sort of norm. I mean, it's very good for us to have that default mode as humans. It's also quite a difficult description of reality, because we use these identities. For instance, if we have 10 girls in front of us, we may call them girls as a group, and not sort of ask everyone if they want, how they want to define themselves. And same, of course, with a group of boys. It makes life easier to use these categories. But with this ideology, we really should ask everyone, how do you self-identify? And some schools with this kind of ideology would start every Monday morning with a pronoun round, so that the pupils are asked to say, well, this week I want to be called he or she or they or them. And the next Monday they ask the same, because you might have changed during the week, since this is a fluid concept. And you can be confused by less than that. No wonder people are sort of, whoa. But that happens in several parts of the world nowadays. And of course this means that the norm critical perspective is a very radical kind of individualization. You don't talk about a collective of a group, but everyone is an individual and should self-identify also in the area of sexuality and identity. So I read some instructions from the Swedish government to our preschool teachers in Sweden. And this was, again, in the heydays of queer theory. And I will give you a couple of quotes from those instructions to show how this ideology is played out in reality. So one piece of advice here from the Swedish government to preschool teachers. If you are planning activities in girls and boys group, think twice about the purpose. Be aware of the fact that it may contribute to maintaining and reinforcing the two-sex norm and pose a risk of children experiencing the approach as unfavorable and offensive. Ensure that there are gender-neutral bathrooms so that children do not have to choose between the girls' and boys' bathroom. So this is quite an advanced social experiment that you are instructed even as a young kid, and of course that's part of the point. You should start early if you want to change attitudes and perceptions. Since you view gender only as a social construct, you need to start early to really influence boys and girls to realize that their gender has nothing to do with who they are. That's what this ideology says. So we should not put people in girls or boys groups, because that sort of reinforces the idea of gender as important. And also gender neutral bathrooms already when you are 3 years old, so people don't reflect on their gender being important. And we have the same idea in the next quote. Staff should review whether activities are characterized by the heterosexuality norm. That is, that the starting point is that people are heterosexual. For example, one promotional effort is to not speculate about if Lisa and Henry, 3 years old, have taken a liking to each other and are a couple in the making. Now, there may be several reasons for the staff not to speculate about who's a couple in the making, but that's not really the issue here. The issue here is that 2 3-year-olds should not be sort of influenced by the thought that as a boy you may fall in love with a girl, and as a girl you may fall in love with a boy, because that would be sort of against the ideals of queer theory. So these are quite advanced sort of ideas about how to raise the next generation. And we've had a lot of this in Sweden. And it comes from the west coast of the US, and I know in Canada it's also a strong ideology, and many other places. But it marks the sort of uniqueness of queer theory. So this is something this is not just a gay or homosexuality thing. Actually, quite a few who would identify as homosexuals would oppose this ideology. Because in the early gay movement, for instance, one of the big slogans was that we are born this way. You may remember that. And that is not necessarily supported by science. I think even homosexuality is often developed during your adolescence. But the idea that you are born this way is, of course, very much against queer theory. saying that I can change whenever I want to, several times during my life. So also the sort of old school gay movement would very much oppose the queer movement. So within the LGBTQ community, there is quite a bit of tension. And the common denominator of these examples are that the wishes of a small minority should govern how we treat everyone else. So a very small minority has this feeling, this perception of identity and sexuality, and to not step on any of their toes, everyone else should adapt to this. What is to me the most problematic aspect of all this is that a small percentage of people will have to wrestle with their identity in a more sort of profound way, and some of them will eventually identify as homosexuals, for instance. And I mean, most children have a period where they sort of wonder a bit about who am I and what does it mean to be a boy, what does it mean to be a girl. It's a very natural process for any human, actually. And what the queer theory does is that it makes this often quite short period of ambivalence, it should define them to be a lifelong ambivalence. And I think that is very unhealthy for most people and unhelpful. But we see already in the West that this has had quite a major impact on the young generation. It goes a bit up and down, and of course different regions would have different trends. I have heard of classes in school where 1/3 of the pupils would not want to describe themselves as either boys or girls. They would say, I'm different or other. And my final slide on this topic can be from a US Gallup made some years ago, where 16% of all young adults identified as LGBTQ. And of these, actually most were identifying themselves as bisexual, which to me is actually saying something different. It's saying that these kids have learned that it's not proper to be certain about your gender or your sexuality. So you have a new default mode, which is bisexual, with any door open. You can choose. Most of these people will eventually end up in heterosexual relationships. We know that also for a fact. But it's very clear that among young adults, it's a trend in the West to not identify with traditional norms. And we see that in these statistics, for instance. So that was a crash course in queer theory. And maybe we should just stop there and see if you have any questions or comments before we get into the trans issue, because it's quite a different issue. And I will tackle that in partly a different way, looking into more of scientific research. But does this make sense, or is it more confusing? I mean, this is partly confusing, but at least I hope you can understand the kind of thinking that is behind queer theory. Are you ready for trans? I think it's time for trans. Because you are probably all aware of the fact that this has been a much debated issue in recent years. And especially we have a massive increase. Once again, I'm not sure about the situation in China, but certainly in actually the whole of the West nowadays, we have a strong increase in teenagers that identify as trans. But first, just to make some distinctions here, because I think that we need to make a difference between trans as a diagnosis and trans as an ideology. Because the diagnosis of transsexualism, looking historically also, is a very rare diagnosis. It has traditionally been used for individuals who all the way since childhood have felt that they were born in the wrong body. And there are no reliable statistics on this actually, but it was generally assumed up until about 10 years ago that this could affect about 1 person in 10,000 or even fewer than that. Very small minority. And the technical term for medical transsexualism that we use today is gender dysphoria. And for some who have received the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, it may lead onwards to hormone therapy or even gender reassignment surgery. And that, of course, has been very much in focus of the discussion. But what has happened, just to sort of broaden the picture here a bit, is that in the recent years, gender dysphoria has started to affect also many people's understanding of gender in general. And then this becomes not just a diagnosis, it becomes an ideology, how we perceive gender in general. So, for instance, in today's LGBTQ movement, the focus is not only on transsexuals in a medical sense, but rather anyone who, for whatever reasons, would feel alien to their biological sex may be called a trans person. So if you're a bit ambivalent about your gender identity, well, maybe you are trans. So that's not a strictly medical term, it's more like an identity term. And this essentially means that gender identity that used to be connected with our biology, obviously, is becoming metaphysical, really. Because you say that you can have a gender identity independent of your body, your biology, your reproductive organs, your chromosomes and hormones. Everything of that is irrelevant as long as you, in your mind, perceive yourself as something else. And that is basically a metaphysical definition. Nothing that you can sort of measure is relevant to your gender identity. And this means that there are quite strong parallels, although there are differences, there are also parallels between trans and queer. Because as with queer, we get a definition of gender and gender identity that exists independently of biological facts. And our creation-given conditions are actually an obstacle to overcome rather than the natural basis of our identity. And remember the 4 points I had before about the biblical view on these issues, where I said that creation is not the problem, it's the starting point. It's a good thing to embrace. Well, trans and queer are both joining hands, so to say, in the idea that creation is the problem. I am above nature. I am above my biology, and I have the right to define myself the way I want to, irrespective of all these other factors. And of course, this also challenges traditional views of developmental psychology, for instance, because traditionally it has always been said that your gender and identity as boy or girl, man or woman, is quite fundamental to a person's self-understanding and a natural part of developing as a human. Here, all this is said to be irrelevant. You just choose for yourself. It's a very radical change. Of course, also concepts such as male and female, masculine, feminine, lose very much of their meaning. And this is also where many feminists have actually criticized the trans ideology, because if gender is only metaphysical, based on how you define yourself, well, then feminism also is quite meaningless. Because why defend these particular 50% of the population if what defines a woman is irrelevant? And of course, many feminists would oppose things like biological men coming to female changing rooms, or competing against women in women's sports, or even actually coming as, for instance, a sexual offender, but being let into a women's prison, which has happened several times. And these situations are very offensive to many feminists. So there's a real clash between those groups. And the trans movement has a term for this. They call these feminists trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And that may sound like a joke, but it's deadly serious, and they hate each other. Because the trans movement feel excluded by these radical feminists. So it's an ongoing battle. But of course, another thing that unites queer theory with trans ideology is that it creates a very strong insecurity among the young generation, of course. Because, I mean, even under normal circumstances, most young people would have some kind of struggle with their identity. But with trans ideology, as with queer ideology, it's of course even harder to find your identity as man or woman. and I think that is really not helpful for most kids. And you saw some examples of how this is embraced in Swedish preschools. And because of this, now is the time for a graph, and this is from Sweden, but I could have used other countries. So these are young people who are going to hospitals to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And you see this is, I mean, this is for the major hospital in Sweden. It was around 10 each year in the whole of Sweden, up until, you see here, 2011, 2012. Then it skyrocketed. And between the year 2001 and the year 2019, it went from 12 young people per year to these institutions to almost 2,000. So that is a 160-fold increase. Not 160%, but 160-fold. It's a huge increase. And we have similar situation in several Western countries. The development is not really as dramatic in recent years in Sweden, partly because this has become a real intense discussion around this. What is important to know here is that, as I said, there is still a very small group of people that could be described as medical transsexuals. But what has happened the last 10 or 15 years is that many young people start to identify as the other sex. There is another sort of dynamic going on around this phenomenon than we were used to with more classical transsexuals. We have a term called rapid onset gender dysphoria that is contested by some, but helps us to see that this is something different than traditional gender dysphoria. Because traditionally, transsexualism or gender dysphoria would be seen very early in life. Already when a child is like 3 or 4 years, the parents would know that this child is sort of acting a bit differently compared to others in the same age and gender. The difference with the kids that have rapid onset gender dysphoria is that these young people tend to come out as trans in a much later stage, often during their teens, and it comes like a bolt from the blue. Even the parents haven't noticed anything from childhood. This just comes as something quite late in life. And also we see, compared to medical transsexualism, a strong overrepresentation of biological girls. So traditionally it has been about two biological men on every biological woman coming out as transsexual. Now, the new move of trans kids would be like 80% biological girls. So it's a real reverse in statistics. And many of these girls, not to say most of them, have other diagnoses like ADHD, but even more so autism. Often things like anxiety, depression, self-harm. So these girls especially are quite similar to when I was in school. We had a lot of young girls having anorexia, she said. And of course, we still have that diagnosis, but it's part of the same kind of girls that tend to have this, because you have the same, you obviously with anxiety and self-harm, a distorted view of your body, obviously, which is central to anorexia. I mean, it's the same here, but it's sort of channeled in a different way. So I think many things speak in favor of this being part of the same phenomenon, but taking a different outcome or expression. And several researchers also talk about social contagion, which is a well-known concept in psychiatry, that some diagnoses are trending and you influence one another. And you may have classes in school with 3 or 4 kids coming out as trans. And I mean, if this used to be 1 person in 10,000, what are the odds of having 3 or 4 in the same classroom? Something very different is going on here that cannot be explained only with sort of medical facts. As this is sort of trending, we also see, as we saw the statistic earlier on, that the concept of gender has changed dramatically, especially among young adults, where we look at different aspects than we used to when it comes to gender. And the idea of gender being fluid is very widespread. So that would be the similarity between trans and queer. But still, of course, there are distinct differences here, because queer is about identity and sexuality being fluid. Trans is basically that I may be the opposite of what my body says. So these are quite different ideologies, but they have the same sort of results. They say that you cannot rely on biology. It may be other factors that define you as male or female or homosexual or LGBTQ. So I don't know how strong this phenomenon is here, but not very strong. We will see. I mean, the sort of phenomenon of transsexualism is known in many cultures, of course, but it has always been a very small minority. And as I said here in the start, I mean, I differ between trans as a condition and as an ideology. And today I would say we are very much influenced in the West by trans as an ideology, saying you cannot rely on biology to define your gender. Basically, we have two ways of tackling this phenomenon. One would be what is often called affirmative therapy or affirmative action. And the other would be more like a sort of wait and see approach to the trans phenomenon. So just to give an example, this is from Canada under Trudeau, who was very much pushing this agenda, and also, of course, the US under Obama and Biden. And I have some quotes from a brochure or guidelines from the provincial government in Alberta in Canada that discusses how to tackle trans kids. And this was like 10 years ago, so I don't know exactly how they do it now, but this manual begins by stating that self-identification is the sole measure of an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And this is quite an astonishing starting point for this whole sort of instruction manual. In reality, it means that neither medical nor psychological expertise should be involved. For instance, if you're a headmaster at a school and you have an 11-year-old girl coming saying, from now on, I'm a boy, you're not allowed to consult with any other person or expertise. You should just accept at face value, okay, from now on you're a boy. That's it. Self-identification is the sole measure of an individual's sexual orientation. After this, the guide moves on to talk about different pronouns that teachers may need to use in the classroom or in public writing, such as the, sie, he, they, or them. Or maybe you write letters home to the parents, and you would normally write Dear Mr. and Mrs. or something like that. Now you should write Dear MX, since it's not sort of given what gender the adults back at home would identify with. You are, of course, not allowed to wear school uniforms or propose dress codes that prevent boys from wearing skirts, it's said very clearly. And you're not allowed to have sporting events or other competitions where boys and girls challenge one another. It's equally reprehensible to break down, for instance, sex education classes in boys and girls, because that only reinforces the stereotype that boys and girls may have different questions or issues concerning sexual education. So that is just prejudice according to this manual. And of course, the most vivid discussions have evolved around the section of the shower rooms, because here you're told that if a pupil finds it challenging to share showers with a person of the opposite biological sex, but who feels that he or she is the opposite sex, then of course since we are not allowed to oppress minorities, if you as identifying with your biological gender are uncomfortable, or if the 10 girls are uncomfortable with someone looking like a boy but identifying as a girl coming to their dressing room, well, then it's them who have to leave the dressing room, because they are the oppressive majority and they could not oppress a minority, in this case a trans child. And it's explicitly stated that a student who objects to sharing a washroom or change room with a student who is trans or gender diverse is offered an alternative facility. And this scenario also applies when a parent or other caregiver objects to shared washroom or change room facilities on behalf of their child. So if mom and dad back home hears about this and start to criticize the school for allowing boys in the girls' room, then it's their girl who has to move to another changing room. It's quite strong words from the Alberta government in Canada in this case. So this is sort of full-on affirmative to fully accept these self-definitions. And just to finalize then, a more cautious approach would be what I would say wait and see approach. And that relies on a couple of important aspects. And one is that we know from experience that most teens who experience gender dysphoria will change in a few years. This will wear off, and most will after a while identify as their biological gender. Not everyone, but most will. And because of that, it may be very wise to not push this too hard in those very sensitive years, but simply wait for a while. And we also know that it takes about the age of 25 until your brain is fully developed and you sort of have the full sort of concept of your decisions and can see what a decision now will involve in the future. For instance, if you do reassignment surgery, that often involves lifelong sterility and of course also medication for life. And those are very big things to live with. And you may not understand when you are 15 what that really means. So many, and I am one of them, would argue that these things would not be allowed until you're at least 25 years old. And then for most, this is not even an issue anymore. This is, once again, the cultural war with two very strong opinions competing with one another. But I would say, once again, simply looking at research and experience, we have very good reason to not push this agenda very hard. Of course, as Christians, we have even stronger reasons to affirm biological gender, while realizing that in a fallen world, there will be some different situations, and we have a very small minority that may never be able to identify with their biological sex. It's a very small portion, and we have to, of course, find ways to include them in the best way possible, because that must be a terrible condition, to be honest. Imagine feeling trapped in your own body for life. That is, I mean, these are really tragic circumstances. But I don't think that the general way to help them is by cutting away